Hi, I'm Bob Greaves, and I have a show here at the place called The Unconventional Pastor, and I would love it if I could get your participation in the show with your questions and your comments by video. Your question or comment can be something about the Bible, theology, maybe something you saw on an earlier show, or something you read in my blog. Here's what I'd like you to do. Make a video in as high quality as you can of yourself asking the question or making the comment. After you've made your video, upload it to Facebook, YouTube, or someplace else where I can find it and make it public or private. Then you can send me a private message in Facebook that includes a link to your video. In your message, make sure that you include your full name spelled correctly. I'm kind of excited about sharing as many of your questions and comments as I can possibly fit in the show. On behalf of the New Covenant Group, I'd like to thank you for your participation in making this show even better. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. It's good to be back with you again on this Wednesday, and I look forward to these times to share with you. And the way that I've been trying to do this is that on Sunday nights when I speak with you, I want to have a guest who can share with you what's going on in their own life that has led them down a path where they, in honesty, had to change some of the ways that they saw things and understood things. And I try to feature some of these people so that we can all take courage in knowing that a call to honesty and a response to what it is that we find meaningful and coherent, and the result of very good questions that we find we must ask, that it's certainly fine for us to entertain various changes in the way we understand the Scriptures, the way we understand Christ. We're all in a process, and we cannot actually successfully navigate that process if we're going to be so rigid that we just have to stay where we are and have certain ideas that we think for some reason we just can't change them. Of course, I'm not talking about having all kinds of wild ideas just because you can, or being radical for the sake of being radical. I really think that it's important that to the degree that we can be in sync with others when we really honestly can be, it's really good to be part of that sort of thing. But because we are ultimately genuinely responsible for our opinions, responsible for the way we think, we must absolutely never abrogate that responsibility to anyone, but in trusting the God who lives within us, dwells within us, who loves us. We are truly free to experiment, to think, to explore, and to be honest. And so I appreciate having many of these guests who are wonderful examples. We had Alan on, I think, last time, and just a delightful, wonderful fellow. I fell in love with him, thought he was just a wonderful guy. Tonight, though, on Wednesdays, I like to share with some of you some of the teaching that I would do. And, of course, my purpose in that is that some people, of course, since they call me unconventional, by teaching you can see why that is so, but it's not so much to show off how unconventional I can be, but to share with you these things that have really taken me away from the path of tradition, and because the honesty that was demanded of me, required of me to do no less. And so For that reason, I had to balk at the things that I once held on to and say, well, I really got to make sense of this in another way. And having done that, there's certainly no need on my part to feel, and so I'm finished, and I'm and this is where I shall stay. It isn't necessarily where I would stay, but I have only one really strong desire, and that is that through honesty, through a continual abiding in the love of God, the sense of His presence that I believe in, that I sense is within me, that I don't always understand, that I can't claim to be able to see and speak for. I just know that I am loved by our Father, and living in that context and exploring and seeking to understand possibly some of the ways that I have been thinking and mulling things about might be of help to others who are wondering and struggling with some of the same issues. Tonight, I want to talk about Christianity's views of sexuality. Normally, I'm not going to be that risque, and I'm not going to be that risque tonight either. It's not my intention to kind of be provocative at all. But I want to talk about this topic because it is a topic that I really believe has been oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes very deeply misunderstood within Christian traditions in a way that has actually injured and hurt and made very difficult the issues of sexuality for many people because of many of the Christian teachings. I mean, we've all recently even heard about some of the scandals, people like Jack Scott, who was unfortunately removed from his ministry when it was found that he had evidently had an inappropriate relationship with a teenage girl there in his congregation. There were many people who were very disappointed, very let down, and some people who even felt that this really brought out the character of some of the people who are part of some of these stronger, more fundamentalist, more controlling and manipulative organizations. Without regard to how we feel about it, it certainly is a tragedy for Jack, his family, and even the family of that young lady involved, and the entire church. But these struggles, I want to argue, are really in some ways the expected result when we don't handle something such as our sexuality in a way that is truly mature and truly appropriate and truly honest. When we embrace a form of morality that is really over the top or strange or really contrary to our real nature as human beings, we're only headed for more trouble, because when it comes down to it, the biology of the body is something that will find a way, and if it doesn't find a healthy way, it'll find an unhealthy way to express itself. And I think that's oftentimes a big part of the driving force behind many of these scandals. Some of these people involved in these scandals would definitely be people who genuinely and sincerely believed in the level of purity they thought they were attaining, but since it was so unrealistic to who they really are as human beings, it ended up basically exploding in their face. Now, for me, I remember I first began to question some of the traditional views that I first experienced at Bob Jones University, and then also later at another Bible school that I had attended. And I had pretty much a standard fundamentalist attitude about sexuality, and I would be only necessary for me to be honest and tell you it wasn't really working out well for me. But I began to really become concerned that there was something really wrong with the way that I was understanding it. Back when I was a pastor of a small church a number of years ago, I think it was the late 70s, early 80s, somewhere around there. I forget my own history sometimes. And I was approached by some people who belonged to an organization called the Citizens for a Decent Community. They may have actually been existent in your area. And these were a group of people who were very concerned and upset about a variety of things. For one thing, they didn't like the idea that children could see some of the pornography that was available in the drugstores and in magazine stands. And so They wanted to get laws passed that these things had to be wrapped or put in out of view of children and things like this. And I think that many of the things they really wanted were reasonable. But they also had a very evangelistic approach to what they were doing, and a deep concern to even have other laws passed and to try and accomplish certain things. While I was pastor of this church, a number of the people involved in that organization came to me and asked me if I wanted to become a part of what they were doing. And as a pastor, I thought it might be a good idea to consider becoming involved in various different community concerns. So I didn't say yes, but I instead said, well, I'll attend several of your meetings and I'll get a sense for what's going on, and then I'll let you know. Well, I did attend a few of their meetings, and I thought about it, and I let them know, and my answer was, no, I really don't see that this is something I can get involved in. And I don't think that I explained myself a great deal to each person who asked me, but I will share with you now that the biggest reason why I found I had to say no is that I was looking at this movement to try to see, what is it doing? How is it doing it? What is its ethical basis for what it's doing? I could understand the concern that it had for what it needed done, but at the same time, I became bothered by its methods. First of all, it was and this is just a matter of personal opinion. I was bothered by the idea that it was an organization that was trying to tell people who were not Christians, people who chose to be involved voluntarily with pornography, trying to actually make it even more difficult for them to obtain it. And although I suppose in some sense that's a good thing, it's still something I perceived as, well, none of your business. It's just not, you're overstepping your bounds. That as Christians, that if we're going to have any influence on the world around us, it's by persuading them to see things in a way where they choose to do or not do certain things. But that's neither here nor there. That was just a personal opinion. The main thing that I found that was troubling me was this. Some of the people that were involved in this organization, it became very clear to me that the main reason why they were involved in this movement was because they themselves, in their own personal lives, did not have this problem under control for themselves. And it was as if they were hoping that if they could somehow get rid of this pornography so that it wasn't even available, they could stop buying it. And that really bothered me. When I'm thinking that people are trying to get pornography out of the way so that they don't get it, but under the guise of trying to keep it away from other people who shouldn't be seeing it, I thought, where do you get the gall to tell other people what they ought to do when you can't even do it? So something's wrong here. And I found myself quite disturbed at it. But at the same time, trying to compare what their goals were with what I understood the Bible to be saying at that time, it didn't seem that off, and yet it didn't really jive well for me. So it made me start to reconsider things. And so as a result of that reconsideration, I really came to a very different view, did a lot of research, read books by people like Patrick Carnes. I think there was a Harvey Milkman and a Stanley Sunderworth, I think his name was. Read several of the books by these people who dealt with these issues and looked at it from a either sociological, psychological, or neurological standpoint. And it made me realize that some things were different. And then I read a couple of books by, I think it was a German theologian. His name was Helmut Tilke. He had I think it was a 4-volume set called Theological Ethics, and volume 3 was on sexuality. An excellent book, an excellent read. And and upon reading these things, I realized that I had to totally revamp the way I understood this issue, and also the way I understood certain scriptures. So I actually got some notes here tonight where I actually made something that I'll do from time to time. I'm going to work from my own translation of Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus is speaking, and this is part of his Sermon on the Mount. And he's speaking from verse 27 to 31, and he says this. Now, before I tell you what he's saying here, I perceive his point, his intent, what he's attempting to accomplish here as quite different than the way I used to. Some Christians today see what Jesus was saying as his way of taking the law on one side and then raising the bar and showing you what true holiness is like. I don't really believe that's what Jesus was doing, and I realize there's a lot of people who think that. But, to me, it doesn't make philosophical sense that if the problem with the law is that telling you you shouldn't do that is something which, in spite of how correct it is that you shouldn't do that, doesn't work, raising the bar and telling you to not do that either isn't going to work any better. In fact, raising the bar like that only adds to the pressure, and I think it only makes that part of the law that doesn't work even worse. So I'm certainly not going to want to take the interpretation of what Jesus is saying in that direction. It just doesn't make philosophical sense in light of how I understand the failure of the law, as even Paul talking about, thou shalt not covet, great coveting in me of every kind. The law is provocative. The law makes suggestions, in fact. But love is the way of Christianity. When we are busy in our lives seeking to live through love, and let's be honest, we don't always live that way. But when that is really our focus, we find ourselves often so preoccupied with doing that which is loving and so preoccupied with beholding the loveliness of people we seek to serve that some of these things they call sin, we don't have time to even think about them. They're irrelevant. And so I see love as the answer, not a raising the bar of what is expected. But anyhow, so here's my translation of Matthew chapter 5 and verses 27 through 31. Jesus is speaking. He says, forgive me for not looking at the camera and reading what I wrote. You've heard the saying, you shall not commit adultery. But in my opinion, everyone who watches a woman wishing to have her has already committed adultery at his very core. If your right eye is why you end up in a scandal, tear it out and throw it from you. For it's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be tossed into the grave. And if your right hand is why you end up in a scandal, well, cut it off and throw it from you. For it's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be tossed into the grave. It was said, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, unless she's sexually unfaithful, makes her a bigamist. And whoever marries such a divorced woman is a bigamist. Now, when we look at these verses, there are a few things in here that I think might be a little bit difficult to understand, particularly even the way that I have translated it. So I'd like to expound a little bit upon these verses. I think that what Jesus is saying here is this. Okay, so you got the law, and the law says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, Jesus is certainly not going to stand up here and say, do whatever you like. It's okay. I don't mind. We know enough about our sexuality to know that it is a very intimate and vulnerable part of ourselves. It's not the sort of thing that we can just be that cavalier about. But Jesus is wanting to show how much the law is so ineffective. It's as if he's saying, okay, so you shouldn't commit adultery. But you know what? Let's be honest here. Let's take a look at what's really going on inside of us. This will show you, if you're going to be honest about what's going on inside of you, just how impractical the law is in spite of how right it might be. Okay, it's not just good enough that you're not, involving yourself in an actual liaison. You're watching women. And really, at your very core of your being, what's the difference in terms of where you're at in your heart with that and adultery? What's the difference? Jesus is trying to really just make the comment. He's not trying to raise the bar and telling you, okay, now, hey, we're raising the standard. Not only don't do it, don't even think about it. Now, when he goes into this next section here, I really believe he's talking about not just the lust of looking, and not just the problem of masturbation, where your right hand, if it causes you to go into scandal, or your eye. What he's actually saying here in these next verses, as I understand it, and maybe I'm wrong, but as I understand it, what Jesus is actually saying here is this: do you know what the penalty of the law is for adulterers? We stone them. So here's something I want you to know. If according to the law we stone adulterers, and you find that you're looking around, and that looking around actually gets you involved in a scandal where you're actually now involved in a liaison, I'm telling you something. Here's a better idea. You would actually be better off tearing your eye out than getting caught in that scandal, having yourself stoned to death and tossed into the grave. Jesus is not threatening people with the fact that if they have lust in their heart, they're worthy of death and having their whole body sent into eternal damnation. That's not even a part of what he's saying here. What he's actually saying is that, look, these adulterous liaisons, they begin with your noticing that woman. So if your eye is going to actually be that which is the start of this scandal, then, pluck it out. I think Jesus is actually offering what is known as a modest proposal. He's being absurd. You really want to do that? Well, I don't suggest it. But, if that's the penalty for adultery, being stoned to death, then, who knows? I guess if you want to add it up philosophically and logically and in some absurd sort of way, that makes more sense to just pluck it out rather than have to go through all of that business. Better to lose one part of your body than to have them stone you to death and lose all your body. And the same thing here is with his hand. Some people have tried to use this verse and saying, and if your right hand offends you, then cut it off. And some people say, well, that's because you're touching yourself. I don't think that's what it's really getting at. Maybe we can talk about that a little later, maybe precisely why I don't see that. But I think that what he's saying, that when you finally commit adultery, you're actually going to be putting your hand upon that other person. You're going to be touching them. You're going to be embracing them. So if you're right-handed, so if it's not just the eye that creates the plan to set up the liaison, but the actual liaison itself, and you actually put your hand to that person, maybe you should cut your hand off. And we're the same kind of logic here with this statement, because I'll tell you what, it's better to lose your hand now than have them catch you in the act of doing this and have them to stone you to death, and then the whole body is lost into the grave. And then Jesus does make this statement, and I think here he is, in a sense, clarifying the bar. That, he perceives marriage as something that is truly very sacred and truly very, very important. And that if you're sending your wife away and you're going through divorces just because, you're willy-nilly not wanting to really maintain the commitment, she spends too much money, I guess, or I don't like the way she nags, or I just don't seem to be able to handle the relationship. Well, maybe you have to learn how to negotiate. You have to learn to grow up. And there may be a lot of reasons why we need to come toward the people we're in relationship with. In fact, I really think that the problems we have in a relationship, no matter what those problems are often the kind of problem that indicates that, hey, evidently this is a weakness you have, and here's a wonderful opportunity to learn how to become the kind of a person who can handle this situation even better. Let's not throw the marriage out, though. And of course Jesus does concede, well, this is a person who's, running around and violating the sanctity of this marriage. Then I guess, but other than that, there's a sense here in which it's like bigamy. It's like, keeping a list of people. You're just no longer with that other person. And so I think that Jesus is really talking about this not as so much as adultery as bigamy. That it's like just connecting yourself to a whole bunch of people in a very casual way. Now, part of the reason why I justify this understanding of what Jesus is saying in this section of Scripture is primarily also because I see that as being something that he is really saying in the section of Scripture right above it. Excuse me, I'm moving a clock so I can see it. I don't want to go over my time. In the verses just above this, verses 21 through 26, Jesus is saying something very similar, and I made a translation of that as well. So I'd like to read that to you so you can see the way in which the understanding that I have and how I translate this. Jesus says, "You have heard that your ancestors were told, 'You shall not commit murder.' And whoever commits murder will be taken to court. But I'm saying that everyone who is angry with his brother should be taken to court. And whoever says to his brother, 'You idiot,' should be taken to the Sanhedrin. And whoever says 'You fool,' ought to have to sit in the city dump while the sun is hot. Therefore, if while you are presenting an offering at the altar and suddenly you recall that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar. Get reconciled to your brother first, and then come and present your offering. Make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you meet on your way in. Avoid having your opponent hand you over to the judge, because the judge will give you to the officer who will throw you in prison. I can honestly say you will not come out of there until you have paid up every last cent." So the spirit in which I'm reading this, I understand Jesus is talking to these people about aspects of the law. And it's as if Jesus is saying, now, wait, hold on. Let's stop talking about law. Let's just get honest here. Let's start talking about how we live. Let's start talking about how we experience these things. Let's talk about the way we think, the way we feel, the way we act, what we're really doing before we even get around to this business of thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that. Now, I would want to argue that this business of raising the bar here actually caused many Christians, in genuine sincerity, to raise the bar so high that they turned it into something that just doesn't really work, can't be managed at all. In fact, the church then, I think, went through a terrible, terrible difficulty when it lost its Semitic roots in times, and there was this Greek philosophy that existed in the West at that time that actually came from early Greek philosophy long before Christianity ever came to Europe. And this philosophy had to do with this, and this was something that most Westerners, people in the European continent, actually believed. Before Christianity came that way, most people really believed that there was a spiritual netherworld of some sort that was perfect and flawless. And then there was also this physical world that was corrupt and flawed and just full of mistakes. You buy things, they get nicked, they wear out. But in this other netherworld, that never happens. Everything there is perfect. And so this was a culture that really believed that the physical world was somehow, just terribly inferior. So inferior, in fact, that it couldn't possibly ever be perfect. And indeed, it was this general philosophy about the difference between the physical world in which we live and the netherworld in which we may be headed someday. It was this difference that actually caused some people in the European continent, when they first heard this gospel about a Jesus who had come as the Son of God, to go, wait, excuse me, wait a minute. You're saying there's a guy who was an actual person, was the Son of God? That's not possible. Everybody knows that anything physical is so corrupt, it's just not possible for God to come in the flesh. And this was part of what they were talking about in the Bible. Is anyone who denies that Christ has come in the flesh is somebody who's an opposer of Christ. And this is because, that was just a Greek notion. It certainly wasn't the way the Semitic people or the Jews or the Christian scriptures thought about these things. This was not part of their philosophy, not their way of breaking down reality, but it certainly was the way it seemed in the West. So the West was already predisposed to perceiving physical things as being corrupt and no good. And so then you combine that with this idea that maybe Jesus is raising the bar, and the church, particularly in centuries ago, went through this horrible period of time where they felt that everything sexual was just wrong. You can actually read some of the church fathers who are talking about this and saying things like, it's permissible for husbands and wives to be engaged in sexual activities, but they should not enjoy it. Which is kind of disingenuous. Why would they be engaged in it if they're not, as if that's going to really happen. But, because they're struggling with this concept that everything physical is somehow corrupt and wrong and terrible and awful and disgusting to God, and that there's terrible high bar, they just turned on sexuality. I really believe that this attitude was a part of what led to some of the horrible sexual abuses that occurred as people tried to stay on top of and manage and regulate their sexual feelings. These things came out and destroyed them in various other ways. I don't like to badmouth people, but let me just use an example that is well known, and I don't think it'd be a bad example to use because this person themselves, talked about it, confessed it, got it out in the open, and allowed it to be public information. Jimmy Swaggart belonged to a tradition that many people within that tradition believed that the only proper way for people to have sexual liaisons was in what we call the missionary position. There was only so many, everything else was kind of an abomination to God. And Jimmy Swaggart had some other feelings. And I think that he really sincerely did not want to engage his wife in sinful acts. And so he wouldn't dream of trying to get her to do certain things, but he found himself with those desires. So what did he do? He went out and he found a prostitute and he paid her to do these certain things. Well, there's a sense in which his trying to understand his feelings, his urges, his desires, and not being able to deal with them honestly in his relationship, and having these false views that, but this is wrong and you can't do this and you're not supposed to do that, loses track of the fact that Paul even, or I don't know if it was Paul or someone, maybe it was Luke, I'm not sure, in the book of Hebrews perhaps, the marriage bed is undefiled and, holy. Basically, if I could be a little bit crass, anything goes. This is your bed. This is your place. These are your bodies. This is your relationship. This is your gift to each other. And but he couldn't do that. And I really think that it was his high bar that actually, in many ways, led to this mismanagement. So I'm going to talk now about what I see as more of a spiritual way of understanding this. And I find that, even in the earlier areas of Genesis, that we see what I would understand as a model of what is understood as the human being and his relationship with a spouse. The creation story has a part in it where God says in that story, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over the cattle of all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Now, in here is actually something that you might not have noticed. This is a triad. A triad is a Hebrew literary element that usually is a way of saying the three different things that are now to be understood as being the same thing. This is something that happens in a lot of Hebrew literature. You say three different things, but you say them one right after the other, and in this triad, people combine them all and realize that what you're saying is that these things are one and the same, all at the same time. Let us make man in our image. The word there for image is actually a word which is it's a male word in terms of the gender of that language. And when he says, according to our likeness, here the word that's translated likeness is actually in the female gender. And then the next thing that God says is, and let them rule. Them rule. And so there's something about the image of God that I understand to be that when God makes man, for him to make man is to make him male and female. For God's image is to be male and female. God possesses all these characters that he's now polarizing in the genders of male and female, as it were. God isn't made of DNA, as it were, so it's in some sense really analogous. It's not literal, can't be. But anyhow, so this is kind of a recognition of God's image, of the feminine and the masculine. and the ability to have a life that involves dominion over the environment that they find themselves living in, that is involved with things that are filled with the plentiful ways that their needs will be met. And then we find this followed again by another triad in the Hebrew, which is God created, the next verse, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. This is another triad that might pass you by. For God to create man in his own image is the same thing for the image of God to be created into man. It might sound like the same thing, but there's an emphasis here that is changing. The emphasis goes to the other syllable, as it were. And it says also, male and female, he created them. Now, I think it was Helmut Tillich who suggested that, in a sense here, that what we're talking about is we're not talking about that, oh, see me, I'm a man. I'm made in the image of God. I don't think that's what it's really saying. I think it's saying we, us, mankind, we as a species, we as a race, we are made in the image of God. I don't know what it is to really be the image of God unless I know what it is for me to be part of the human race. I don't really know what it is for me to be the image of God unless I also very vicariously care about and empathize with and understand what it is from the feminine perspective in the relationship that I have with my wife. God created us in his image, male and female. And so I see here something going on very, very intimate and very strange, very mysterious. And this is kind of revealed to us in this section here of Scripture. Now, this is back in a day when perhaps not a lot was known about the physiology and biology and hormones and blood chemistry. But these days we know a great deal about it. We actually know so much more than we ever did before. And there's certain biological realities that I think it's very important for us to be honest about when we're going to try and come up with a morality. For one thing, I don't believe any morality of any sort is ever real or compelling or binding on anyone when it really doesn't involve honesty with the way things actually are. It can't be immoral for me to not be 6'3" when I'm actually 5'9.5". That's what I am, and it can't be a moral problem for me to not be shorter or taller. I mean, that's just an absurd sort of thing. It can't possibly be that I'm to be found immoral because of something that is totally involuntary, something that is beyond my control, and all that sort of stuff. Well, when we take a look at the human being, we discover that there's some interesting differences between men and women. For one thing, one of the things that we notice when we take a look at the physiology and the biology of men and women is we notice that the size of the brain is a little bit different. Although men's brains tend to be on average a little bit larger, there's this area between the two hemispheres called the corpus callosum. And that area tends to be actually larger in the woman than it is in the man, even though their brain is, on average, a little smaller. In case you're wondering, by the way, my degree is in human development, so I study all this stuff. Anyhow, part of the function of the corpus callosum is that it helps to integrate various areas of the brain. And in a sense, it's like all these different areas of the brain for the woman are on Roadrunner, and their own internal internet, as it were, is on broadband. But men, their corpus callosum is smaller, and so consequently the integration of various areas of the brain is not operating at the same speed or with the same efficiency. So this is the way it's often understood or explained. And as a result, this is one of the reasons why it's far more natural for the male to be linear. Men have feelings just like women do, but men sometimes have to stop thinking and start feeling, and then stop feeling and start thinking, because they don't seem to be able to do both at the same time. And so things are a little bit different, less simultaneously integrated. Some people feel this might also be an explanation why Women are capable, much more capable than men, of doing certain kinds of multitasking, whereas men can only multitask usually very well when all of the tasks are represented in some coherent concept as working together. Anyhow, so this is one of the biggest differences between men and women and causes us to think very differently. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think it causes us to think very differently about when it comes to our sexuality. For one thing, well, let me talk about that now then. For one thing, with the male brain, the way that it works, because it's so much more linear, the man finds it far more logical to seal commitments before he can, he needs to seal expectations before that can open him up to commitments. A man tends to want to know, okay, what's going on here? What am I going to see? What is it going to be like? What are all the terms? And only after they understand all of this are they willing to make a commitment based on what it is they're able to now logically, sequentially understand. Women tend to be more cooperative and more multiplexed at the time when they're doing various things relationally. And so as a result of this, they really want commitment. They're ready for commitment right away. To them, commitment is something to start with. And in a sense, they need to find this commitment to be something they can count on before they're able to psychologically become open. Now, the way this translates into sexuality is that men and women operate with sexuality very differently in certain respects. One is this. There's a sense in which a man has a hard time, and he's hardwired this way, to think in terms of committing to a relationship if he doesn't feel he can expect that this relationship is going to be one that is sexually fulfilling. And it's not because he doesn't have proper priorities. This is natural for him to think. Now, certainly this is something that has to be worked out and negotiated. But this is his logical starting point. The woman, on the other hand, she's not ready to say, sure, we're going to make this a sexual fulfilling thing. But what about the commitment? No, she can't do that. The woman needs to know that there's a genuine commitment going on before she's able to sexually feel that she can open up. And so there's a sense here in which they've got this reversed. Expectation leads to commitment in the man, but commitment leads to openness, which then fulfills the expectation in the woman. So they're coming at this from two different directions, and it operates within them in two different directions. I actually think this is part of God's design. Because you see, this becomes a conundrum. This becomes a problem. In some ways, if we're going to be people who are utilitarian and saying, okay, what's this relationship got in it for me? If a man and a woman come together, they're going to be, working this problem out. But this is a problem that is more resolved when we love each other. When we realize that loving another human being, caring about them as a person, caring about their experience. This means that for the man, he can explore this expectation. He can appreciate the commitment that his wife-to-be might need. The wife can also understand and appreciate the expectation. And they can kind of work this through together and finally, negotiate that through trust in love. And then as their relationship develops, this becomes a non-issue as both of them are going through commitment that is really true and strong, and both of them are going through an openness. And it then becomes now a cycle that actually drives like a flywheel, maintains the inertia of the relationship. As openness leads to more commitment, and more commitment leads to more openness, and the relationship grows. I really see that as putting us in a conundrum where love is the only way to handle it that works differently. There's also something else, and not to get too graphic, but also I think that part of our biology forces us to approach sexuality very differently. For one thing, and I can't recall, and this may also be something I read from Helmut Tillich. It's been a long time. I think I read those books back in the 80s. Maybe even earlier. The fact that the male sexuality is something that is sort of external to his body, gives him a sense of externalness in terms of his sexuality, whereas the woman, her sexual organs are something that are part of in the internal aspect of her body. As a result, what sexuality is for both men and women is something that involves a great deal of personal vulnerability, but it is very different in terms of the personal space that it takes. And this causes both of them to approach that personal space in a very different way. The man finds that that external space allows him to really, sad to say, if you find this disappointing, that sexuality can be for him far more impersonal, far less involved. But for the woman, this is her personal space. This is right there where she is at. And so as a result, they end up with this conundrum of vulnerability again, and insecurity. Again, a problem that I feel can only be best resolved when the two people involved truly love each other and care for each other. Now let's bring this back to a Christian concept of morality. I certainly am not a person who would want to argue that we as Christians can just do whatever we want and it's okay and it doesn't matter what you do. God loves you, he'll forgive you, or whatever we want to say. I really think that who and what we are as people it represents something that can be damaged, hurt, violated, and that our best interests involve really taking care of who we are and taking care of who the people are that we're having a relationship with. And so I really think that there is a sense in which we need to regard our sexuality in a very, very sacred, a very meaningful, and a very treasured way. But that we have to recognize that in doing this, that we're going to operate very differently. Among these things are the things that involve, we operate differently. Men, because of their sexuality being external to them, because of the size of the corpus callosum, they're more linear thing. One of the things that's true about men is men are far more visual. They're hardwired that way. That's the way they are. They don't choose that. They don't decide that. And so this is one of the reasons why Jesus is even talking about this. Hey, guys, you're watching, you're looking, and you're kind of scheming and making plans in your mind. This is something easy for men to do. It's something that is for them easy as falling off a log. And this is something that sometimes is troubling to both men and women, almost to the point where it's very difficult for men and women to be very honest with each other about what they do, about what's going on. Looks like I'm getting a question. Let's see what we got here. Yes. Okay. Within 4. I got you. That's my producer talking to me, letting me know how the time is going. With what we have here is that men and women in behaving very differently and responding very differently, we sometimes behave in ways where we wish, well, why can't she, be this way? Or why does he have to be this way? And I want you to know something. I don't know that any of us ever really understand why we are different in the way that we are. And I don't know that we will always understand our behavior. But I think that in love, we violate each other when we are not willing to accept these differences, accept the even mystery of them, recognize that both of us as men and women are often behaving in ways that the other gender doesn't understand, can't appreciate perhaps, or at least unless they empathize. This again represents a problem that can only be resolved by deciding and choosing that you are going to love each other, that you're going to care for each other, that you want to be honest, that you want to be sensitive, and you want to be accepting. And you want to realize that you're now in relationship with someone who is in some ways a lot like you, and in other ways, very different. Different in a way you can't even understand. But I don't think we want to take our morality by coming up with all of these do's and don'ts and borders and this and that. It's good enough to know that people ought to be respected, that people need to be loved, they need to be treasured, they need to have their vulnerability protected and treasured. And I think that in men and women, this is a very difficult thing to do until they actually come into a relationship where they are monogamously, genuinely committed to each other, and they work out all of these issues over time, because they don't happen the moment they get married. It comes within their relationship, and as they grow, as they go through life together, this becomes something very treasured and very precious. But I would want to say, we need to get away from this concept that God is somehow very, very concerned about all the kinds of things you do in your bedroom. that is just a horrible residual concept that comes from the Greek philosophy that at one time terribly corrupted the kind of concepts of rigid, weird sexual morality that has plagued the church. When I was working for a while with people who were struggling with sex addiction, I found that this was a shame-based dynamic. And the thing that I found most interesting is that when I had an opportunity where I used to be the organizer and director of an organization called Agape Renewal, which reached out to people struggling with various different sexual obsessions. And I found that the odd thing was this: the more shame-based, the more I'm just a horrible, awful creature because of the feelings and the behavior that I have, the more a person had that kind of a dynamic, the more they were likely to find this a problem they couldn't get on the other side because shame drove it. Anyhow, that's my little spiel about sexuality. I hope that it was meaningful to you, perhaps a little unconventional, but I'll tell you what, love each other, be good to each other, and be who you are. I'll see you on Sunday. Take care. Bye. Hi, I'm Bob Greaves, and I have a show here at the place called The Unconventional Pastor, and I would love it if I could get your participation in the show with your questions and your comments by video. Your question or comment can be something about the Bible, theology, maybe something you saw on an earlier show, or something you read in my blog. Here's what I'd like you to do. Make a video in as high quality as you can of yourself asking the question or making the comment. After you've made your video, upload it to Facebook, YouTube, or someplace else where I can find it, and make it public or private. Then you can send me a private message in Facebook that includes a link to your video. In your message, make sure that you include your full name spelled correctly. I'm kind of excited about sharing as many of your questions and comments as I can possibly fit in the show. On behalf of the New Covenant Group, I'd like to thank you for your participation in making this show even better.